I often like to open with a story, but the message today is a story itself. In fact, it's my favorite story that Jesus told. So I invite you to listen to it and perhaps follow along in your own Bible as I share it in a few moments. Reading from Luke 15:11-24 in the New Living Translation. Jesus told them this story. A man had 2 sons. The younger son told his father, "I want my share of your estate now before you die." So his father agreed to divide his wealth between his sons. A few days later, this younger son packed all his belongings and moved to a distant land, and there he wasted all his money in wild living. About the time his money ran out, a great famine swept over the land and he began to starve. He persuaded a local farmer to hire him, and the man sent him into his fields to feed the pigs. The young man became so hungry that even the pods he was feeding the pigs looked good to him, but no one gave him anything. When he finally came to his senses, he said to himself, "At home, even the hired servants have food enough to spare, and here I am dying of hunger. I will go home to my father and say, 'Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son. Please take me on as a hired servant.'" So he returned home to his father. And while he was still a long way off, his father saw him coming. Filled with love and compassion, he ran to his son, embraced him, and kissed him. His son said to him, "Father, I have sinned against both heaven and you, and I am no longer worthy of being called your son." But his father said to the servants, "Quick, bring the finest robe in the house and put it on him. Get a ring for his finger and sandals for his feet. And kill the calf we have been fattening. We must celebrate with a feast. For this son of mine was dead, and has now returned to life. He was lost, but now he is found." So the party began. I'm sure this is a familiar story to so many of us. Nevertheless, we may be surprised that God decides to say something fresh to us today through this familiar story that Jesus told. Or he may remind us of issues that are yet unresolved. So you realize that when the younger son asked for his inheritance, what he was really saying to his dad was, "Dad, I wish you were dead. I'd be better off if you were dead." This insult is so much deeper for a Middle Eastern person than for someone from a background like mine. In fact, it was the deepest insult you could offer, to talk about an inheritance while your father was yet living. The father would have been cut to the heart to hear his son say such words. Most of us in this culture don't understand how deep a culture like that would feel, how deeply they would feel the pain, the shame that someone would come and say such a thing to them, how a culture that has so much to do with shame and saving face, that these are almost the worst crimes you can think of committing. We don't understand that. But that is the day and the culture that Jesus was speaking this story into. But still, we can feel the pain and the hurt that this father experienced. Well, some of us who are dads and moms know that pain firsthand for sure. And we have a real sense of what the father in this story felt. The laws of inheritance in ancient Israel required that a double portion went to the oldest son. And so in this case of this particular estate, the father had two sons. The oldest one would get twice as much as the younger one. The younger one knew he was in line for 1/3 of the estate, and that's what he was asking for. The oldest son with his 2/3 was also expected to take over the inherited land and take care for any remaining relatives that required his care. But the youngest son asked for and received his 1/3 of the estate. He took his money and left. This was the first unusual feature in this story that Jesus told. And many who were listening to him, I'm sure, were shaking their heads at this son's awful behavior. Now, when you read the parables of Jesus, that's one of the things you need to look for, is the features of his story that break the bounds of what is normal, what is usual. Because that's probably where Jesus wants us to pause and reflect and think. So this first break with the ordinary was the insulting behavior of the younger son. The second break, which was probably more astounding to Jesus' listeners than even the first, was the father's response. What do you think of the father in this story? What do you think of him? What do you think about what he did? Should he have done it? Would you have done it? Have you done it? Where was the wisdom? Didn't he know what his younger son would likely do if he got the money outright? Didn't he know that his younger son was not capable of handling that much money? Dealing with such a great temptation, didn't he know? Where was his wisdom? Didn't he know what his younger son would likely do? Couldn't he see what was coming? Well, I say yes, he did. He could. But he let him have it all anyways. He had to let him go, didn't he? He had to let him go. You can't forcibly keep your child. Some try. It doesn't work out well. We know that. He had to let him go. But did he have to let him go with all that money? That's the question. The tongues may wag. His wisdom as a parent definitely questioned. But he had to let him go, didn't he? But did he show such a lack of judgment in doing it? Was that the point of the father in the story? What do you think? What do you think of the father in the story? Do you recognize him? It's the Father himself. Or perhaps, most likely, the Son of God himself, taking the image of Father for the sake of the story. God himself portrayed in the image of a father for the purposes of the story. You see, every evil use of resources is an abuse and misuse of the gifts of the Father. Every harm done uses resources given by the Father. All the evil formerly done in darkness and now done shamelessly in the light is all done with the wealth from the hand of God. God has never given any bad gifts. God cannot do that. But the sin in our fallen human hearts has turned so many of his good gifts to an evil purpose. Doesn't God know what evil men will do, the evil deeds they will do with the good gifts he gives? Yes. Yes. And he gives them still. What do you think of that, Father? Let me ask you, were Adam and Eve prepared in the garden for the gift of freedom they enjoyed? Didn't God know what they could do with that gift of freedom? And with their freedom, Adam and Eve purchased bondage. There was only one small area that was out of bounds for them. One small area that God said no. And into that area they had to go. And so we read of the first trespass against God. And ever since, every believer has needed to pray as Jesus taught us to pray daily. Forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us. Now, when the time comes that a parent must let their child go, to some degree, we all wonder, how will he come back? How will she return? The father in the story definitely had to be wondering, and we see his behavior later on revealing that this was in his mind, his question, how will my son come back? Will he return? Will he make something of himself? Will he become a success? Perhaps he will return and take on a mature partnership with me. It will be a proud business called Goldstein and Son. Will he become an outward success, but have a shallow soul? You know, visits once a year, out of obligation, but consumed with his own self, with his own wealth. An outward success, but a shallow soul. Or perhaps he will, more likely, waste everything and return home broke, begging for more money to support his lavish lifestyle. Will he waste it all? The father would wonder. Will he have to hit rock bottom before he will turn or return to his senses? Or, heaven forbid, a parent wonders, will some tragedy take them away forever with no chance for us to see the blossoming of his soul? Now we know from the story Jesus told, the son was making poor choices. Question in the story is, will he come to his senses before it is too late? How will he come home? The father lives without knowing. Let's talk for a few moments about the son's choices. He thinks that freedom means doing what I want. That's being free. I have to tell you, that is a mistaken idea. That's a mistaken notion about what genuine freedom is. That freedom is just doing what I want, that nobody else can tell me what to do. That idea about freedom results in increasing burdens, oppression, even bondage. The younger son found out. For the younger son headed off to do what he wanted to do. He kicked off restraints. He left the father's home. But what he wants and what he gets are two different things. God's idea of freedom is this: to become who he means us to be, to become what we ought to be. That's God's idea of freedom. Not that we become servants of our desires and lusts and appetites, no. Not a slave to ambitions either, or bound to our money, constricted by our need to be recognized or approved by others. That's not freedom, that's bondage. There are consequences for poor decisions and rewards for better choices. There are, though they are not always visible. Not always visible rewards or consequences. True, not yet. Now the father hopes his son will make wise choices and grow into maturity. And then he will learn, discover, and live in the freedom of who he was meant to be. It's like a bird is made to fly, a fish is made to swim. That's their God-intended environment, their God-intended experience. Every man and every woman is made to live for God. Like a bird lives in the air and a fish lives in the sea, so we are made to live in God, in whom we live and breathe and have our being, as the Apostle Paul wrote. For in God we find true freedom. And God looks for us to grow up as his mature sons and daughters. He desires that we live in freedom, that we learn our true heritage as his children. He wants us to know what it is, what it means to have God as our Father, Jesus as our brother, the Spirit of God as our life-giving helper. That's God's desire for us, and it is good. There is a British poet who lived in the 18th century in England, Samuel Taylor Coleridge. He wrote the poems The Rime of the Ancient Mariner and Kubla Khan, which most of us have probably never read. He once had a discussion with a man, the story goes, who firmly believed that children should not be given formal religious instruction, but left free to choose their own religious faith when they reached maturity. Well, the story goes, Coleridge didn't disagree at the time, but he took his friend out back and showed him his garden. The visitor exclaimed, "You call this a garden? There's nothing but weeds here." "Well, you see," Coleridge replied, "I did not wish to infringe on the liberty of the garden. I didn't wish to infringe on the liberty of the garden in any way. I was just giving the garden a chance to express itself." Well, you know, that is freedom of a certain kind, but it's not the kind of freedom that will develop a healthy garden. It's not the kind of freedom that will develop a healthy life. The intended growth is bound and restricted by the unintended growth. Weeds grow naturally. The religious training of children requires the very best efforts of parents, with the church coming alongside to help as we may. Parents first, it must be said. But there does come a point where, having done all we can, we just have to let the child go. The father in Jesus' story would have done what he could to instruct his son in the ways of faithfulness, in the ways to live. He would have done that, but he still had to let him go. Ultimately, the son has his own choices to make. And the father in the story even allowed him an entitlement. Now, it took Jesus only a short phrase to sum up the life chosen by the younger son: wasteful and riotous living, in the New American Standard. He wasted all his money on wild living. Modern novels might make the entire series out of that one phrase. Jesus, just a couple words. No elaboration needed. Unfortunately, our imaginations fill in the blanks, don't they? The son turned his back on his father's way of life. He refused his father's counsel. He bought into the myth that, given enough resources, we can live life as we want without restraint. And for a time, before the money ran out, he had a good time. But how would he come home? Those who helped him waste his life and consume his inheritance deserted him when calamity struck, obviously, and he hits bottom. He is a Jewish boy slopping the hogs. Now, for me, growing up in a Mennonite farming community, it was no disgrace whatsoever to slop the hogs. Hogs were valuable, you make money out of it, but for a faithful Jewish family, it was utter disgrace, for you were not allowed to consume pork. Still today. A Jewish boy slopping the hogs. Do you understand how that would have shocked Jesus' listeners? It was a far country indeed into which this little, or young boy, I should say, into a far country indeed that he had wandered. Impoverished, starving, living like a pagan. But there in the pig pen, he had a revelation. He saw himself and he saw his father in a new light. He came to his senses, the Bible says. Literally, it says he came to himself, understood himself for the first time, and a light turned on in his mind. Well, what changed? Here's what changed. He gained a truer picture of his father. He gained a truer picture of his father. He saw his father more like he really was. The son had been living his life to this point with the misconception about his father. And it took rock bottom for him to realize that his father was not some mean old killjoy stick in the mud person, but there was actually evidence that his father was good, kind, merciful. How did the son know this? He treated his servants with respect and with care. They were provided for, even his servants. And certainly he had provided for his own children. Let me say, our Father in heaven is a good Father. And he too provides. He provides. I have to say, so much waywardness among Christians can be driven by a misconception about who our Father in heaven is, what he is really like. Marge Elford, whose husband Bud was director of Northern Canada Evangelical Mission for many years, once commented on the spiritual struggle of a younger friend of hers without naming her. And Marge said something like this, that she needs to come to know God as her Father. That was the obstacle for her spiritual development, Marge saw. She needs to come to know God as her Father. She believed that her issues would find some resolution when she came to the place of knowing God as her Father and through the Lord Jesus as well. Now, having served the people of God in a few congregations over the past 40 years, I think many believers need to be reconciled to the reality of who God is as Father. So many of us need to have a truer picture of God. We need misconceptions wiped away, wherever the source of them, so often from our relationships with our earthly dads. We need to see the true Father as he really is. Well, here's how the Bible portrays God as a father. Listen. He is caring, with our best interests at heart. Your Father in heaven is not willing that any of these little ones should be lost. Matthew 18:14. He is attentive to our needs. Your Father knows what you need before you ask him. Matthew 6:8. He is good and generous. If you then, though you are evil, know how to give good gifts to your children, how much more will your Father in heaven give good gifts to those who ask him? Matthew 7:12. He is on the side of the weak, a defender and protector. A father to the fatherless, a defender of widows, is God in his holy dwelling. Psalm 68:5. God the Father is full of mercy. He himself is kind to ungrateful and evil people. Be merciful, just as your Father is merciful. It's the true knowledge of God as Father. It's the true knowledge of the Father that gives the Son hope and courage to set his face towards home and begin the journey. Not daring to hope that he could be reinstated as a son, yet he was hoping for grace and favor in the eyes of his Father, and so he heads on his way. Now here's the evidence of the son's genuine repentance. He turned toward home. The word repentance means a change of mind. It involves a turning around. The son changed direction and headed toward the Father's place. He rehearses his lines. He rehearses them so that he won't forget what he needs to say, what must be said. And by the way, that's a good idea whenever we have an apology that we need to make, to plan what we need to say, to plan what we will not say, to take the responsibility on us, to not say, but you were responsible too. Just to make your statements take full responsibility. And so the son rehearsed what he would say to his father. The son planned to say, Father, I have sinned against heaven and in your sight. I am no longer worthy to be called your son. Make me as one of your hired servants. I have a book on the parables of Jesus by Helmut Thielicke, and the title of the book is The Waiting Father, taken from the first parable he deals with. My father-in-law taught a course on the parables for the Capernry School at Thetis Island one summer and gave me this book. It's not a long book, but I have read it many times. And ever since he gave me that book and I read this commentary on the parables of Jesus, I've always called this story the story of the waiting father. It's commonly known as the story of the prodigal son, but there are two sons, and the father is the chief character and the hero of the story. It's the story of the waiting father. That's something we need to know about the Father. He is waiting. One more thing about God the Father. He is waiting for us still. The father in the story, how many times did he go to the road and scan the horizon looking for his son? Where would he see him? Would he see the first glimpse of his son coming over the last rise in the road? How often did he walk there and simply wait? It must have been often, because when the son finally returns, and it would have been quite a delay, when the son finally returns, the father is there to see him, and he welcomes him home. He runs towards him. Oh, now here's something else that the first listeners of the story would have objected to. This is out of character for a Middle Eastern father who has been so insulted and abused by his son. He should make the son grovel if he sees him at all. But Jesus shocks his listeners. The father in the story runs to his son, puts his arms around him, and welcomes him home. My son, you've returned. And how heaven rejoices among us when one turns back to the Father. If you will read the entire chapter of Luke 15, you will see that this is the actual theme of the chapter. How heaven rejoices at one sinner who repents and turns their heart towards home. I shared in a backyard baptism, in a hot tub baptism last Sunday afternoon. One of our own young women has taken the step of faith and obedience to identify with Jesus in this way, and it was a real joy for us to share in that in these lockdown days. According to the rules and regulations, we complied. It was great, and her husband and her children there witnessing it. It was a joyful time for me. It really was. And you know, I don't express joy that well, but it made me so glad. You see, if we miss this, we miss the main point of the story, the Father's joy at his son's return. God rejoicing when a sinner turns around and heads toward home. The father appears to cut short the apology. The son starts his rehearsed lines, saying them word for word as he planned to say them, but he doesn't get to the end. The father cuts it short. And nothing less than a grand celebration will do to welcome his son returning home to his house. What a lavish outpouring of love. You see, that was the very thing happening in the ministry of Jesus. And that's what caused him to tell these stories. For it was creating some notoriety, because the notorious people, the notoriously sinful people, were flocking to hear Jesus, turning to him, becoming followers of him. and they came to cast themselves on the mercy of God they saw revealed in the face of Jesus. And they found his arms open wide. And if we throw ourselves on God's mercy, we will find his arms open wide to welcome us home with great joy. There were others listening to the story who did not feel that keen welcome by the Father. There were others listening, and their story is mirrored in the second part of the story Jesus told. Today, it's enough for us to focus on the Father's welcoming attitude, his arms open wide, to welcome us to him. The Father is waiting still. Some of you remember the Watoto Children's Choir from Uganda. We have hosted them twice in the last few years and rented the Civic Center to share it with our community, and they were just wonderful. And many of you had a chance to interact with them personally. You maybe billeted them in your home, or you shared in the meals we provided for them, or you saw them during setup and rehearsals, and they impressed me. So orderly, so respectful, so apparently well cared for and loved. These children of Uganda, whose parents, if they were living, were unable to care for them, had been taken in by the Watoto community and given a home, and they were welcomed, and they were so obviously loved and cared for. The family had stepped in, the Watoto family had stepped in to care for them, to nurture them, to help them, to teach them, to lead them, to train them. Someone became God's hands and God's feet to reveal the Father's heart for these children. And so they were rescued and brought to the feet of Jesus, given a home, given a family. For some of us, you need to hear this. The Father is still waiting for you. He is waiting for us to turn. And he is waiting with us for others that we love to return to him or to turn to him for the first time. The Father is waiting still. Is it time for you to turn to the Lord, to return to him? Is this a day for you to pray yet once again for those you love, perhaps your child or your friend, your brother or your sister, your father or your mother, for them to turn to the Lord? The Lord is waiting alongside you for them to turn as well. God is waiting. His arms are open wide. God bless you.